22 the $25 AMISH wind generator that runs your fridge forever. No solar, no grid, no bills. The glass sweats in your hand before the sun is even gone. You sit down for 10 quiet minutes on the porch, and the mosquitoes find you first. One on the ankle, another behind the ear, then three more buzzing where you can hear them but never quite see them. Before long, the chair is empty and the porch belongs to the bugs. That scene plays out across thousands of backyards every summer evening. What caught my attention years ago was a neighbor who seemed untouched by it. His place sat closer to the woods than mine. There was standing water down the road after every rain. Yet somehow, while the rest of us slapped and swatted, he sat calmly in a faded lawn chair beside a small metal pot that sent a thin ribbon of smoke into the air. 12 minutes, that was the number he gave me when I finally asked what he was doing. The strange thing was not the smoke. The strange thing was how little of it there was. And stranger still was what he told me the whole setup cost. Because the answer was less than what most folks spend on a cup of coffee. But before that little pot makes sense, you need to understand why so many mosquito solutions seem to promise more than they deliver. Before we get into that, I always enjoy hearing from people who still remember the old ways. If you grew up around a farm, a barn, a porch full of relatives, or a grandfather who seemed to know a trick for every problem, you're among friends here. And if there's one household habit from years ago that still earns its place today, keep it in mind. We'll come back to it later. For years, I treated mosquitoes the way most people do. I looked for a product. That seems to be how we're taught to think now. There is a product for every inconvenience, a gadget for every annoyance, and a refill plan for nearly everything in between. So when mosquito season arrived, I bought what was sitting on store shelves: sprays, traps, candles, little devices that promised relief. Some worked for a while, some barely seemed to matter. Yet every summer the same thing happened. The mosquitoes came back, and the wallet got lighter. That pattern starts wearing on a person after enough seasons. The neighbor I mentioned earlier was named Earl. He was the kind of man who repaired things before replacing them. His shed smelled faintly of motor oil and cut lumber. Every board had a purpose. Every jar held something useful. One evening I noticed him sitting outside while everyone else drifted indoors. He wasn't waving his arms around. He wasn't stomping mosquitoes on his jeans. He looked comfortable, not perfectly protected, just comfortable enough to enjoy the evening. That difference mattered, because most people are not looking for perfection. They just want to sit on their porch without feeling like supper for a swarm. What struck me first was how ordinary the setup appeared. No glowing lights, no batteries, no extension cords crossing the yard, just a metal container resting on a patch of bare ground. A faint stream of smoke rose upward, almost disappearing before it reached the tree branches. I remember thinking there had to be more to it. Surely the real trick was hidden somewhere else. Maybe some expensive ingredient, maybe some specialty tool. But Earl shrugged the way practical men do when they think you're overcomplicating things. That reaction planted a question in my mind that stayed there for weeks. Why did older country families seem less obsessed with destroying every mosquito and more focused on managing them? The distinction sounds small. It isn't. One approach tries to win a war, the other tries to reclaim an evening. Many old farmers understood something that often gets overlooked. Nature is rarely defeated, it is usually guided, redirected, worked around. You see that mindset in gardens, you see it around livestock, and according to many old-timers, you see it in mosquito season too. That idea became more interesting to me than the smoke itself because it suggested a completely different way of looking at the problem. The more I paid attention, the more I noticed how often mosquito control gets sold as an all-or-nothing promise. The language changes every few years, but the message stays familiar. Buy this, replace that, subscribe to something else. The goal always seems to be total victory. Yet people who spend a lot of time outdoors often have a simpler target. They want enough relief to enjoy supper outside. They want to weed a garden row. They want grandchildren to chase lightning bugs without running indoors 5 minutes later. That is a much different goal, and sometimes different goals lead to different tools. Now, I want to be fair. Mosquitoes are not imagined. They are not harmless annoyances in every situation. Anyone who spends time outside knows they can make an evening miserable. In some places, they are far worse than in others. Conditions matter, rainfall matters, standing water matters, even the direction of the wind matters. That is why I get cautious whenever somebody claims one answer solves everything. Real life is rarely that tidy. The methods that tend to last are usually the ones that respect reality instead of arguing with it. That becomes important when we finally talk about the smoke pot itself. One evening, after enough curiosity got the better of me, I walked over and asked Earl what was actually inside that little metal container. He smiled, but not in a secretive way. More in the way somebody smiles when they know the answer will disappoint your expectations. Because I was expecting complexity. I was expecting some hard to find ingredient, maybe a specialty product ordered through the mail. Instead, he pointed toward a few plain items that looked like they belonged in any garage, shed, or workshop. That was the moment I realized the smoke was not really the story. The thinking behind it was, and that thinking goes back much farther than most people realize. Long before modern backyard products filled entire aisles, families living close to fields, animals, gardens, and water had already spent generations observing what happened when air moved a certain way, when smoke drifted through a sitting area, and when evening routines matched the rhythms of the land around them. The surprising part is not that they used smoke. The surprising part is why a little smoke often did more than many people expected. And once you understand that, the tiny metal pot begins to make perfect sense. The reason that little pot looked so unimpressive is because many traditional approaches were built around changing conditions, not chasing complete elimination. Old homesteads operated close to the land. People paid attention to wind, shade, damp ground, standing water, and animal areas because those things shaped daily life. Mosquitoes were simply another part of that picture. Many old farmers say you learned quickly where mosquitoes gathered and when they became most active. Instead of trying to wipe them from existence, you made the space around people less inviting. That difference matters. One approach depends on constant escalation. The other depends on observation. Observation is slower, but it often costs a whole lot less. I remember my grandmother talking about summer evenings when families gathered outdoors after chores were finished. Nobody expected a bug-free world. That idea would have sounded strange to them. What they wanted was enough comfort to sit together, shell peas, tell stories, and enjoy the cooler air before bedtime. Around many rural places, smoke was already part of everyday life. Cooking fires produced it. Burn barrels produced it, brush piles produced it. Livestock areas sometimes had it drifting nearby. Tradition holds that people notice mosquitoes often behave differently around those spaces. Not gone, not defeated, just less eager to settle where people were gathered. That observation lines up with something practical. Mosquitoes rely heavily on scent and air movement when locating hosts. They are surprisingly sensitive to changes in the environment around them. When conditions shift, their patterns can shift too. A thin layer of drifting smoke may help disrupt the comfortable path they would normally take into a sitting area. Notice the wording there. Help, not guarantee, not eliminate, help. That honest distinction is important because it separates realistic expectations from marketing promises. The goal is not to create a sterile backyard. The goal is to make your porch, patio, or garden corner a less convenient destination for mosquitoes. This is where many homeowners accidentally work against themselves. They buy products expecting battlefield results. Then they judge every method by the impossible standard of complete victory. When that standard is not met, disappointment follows. Yet practical people often measure success differently. If you can sit outside for an hour with far fewer interruptions, that is meaningful. If grandchildren stay out longer catching fireflies, that matters. If supper moves back to the porch instead of the kitchen table every summer evening, that matters too. Small improvements sound boring in advertisements. In real life, they can make a surprisingly large difference. The companies selling mosquito solutions are not villains. Most are simply serving a market. But recurring products naturally encourage recurring purchases. New cartridges, new refills, new systems, new upgrades. There is nothing mysterious about that. The structure rewards ongoing spending. What caught my attention about the smoke pot idea was that it followed a completely different logic. The materials were simple. The maintenance was simple. The explanation was simple. Simplicity can feel suspicious these days because we have become used to complexity carrying a higher price tag. Yet some of the most enduring household practices survive precisely because they remain understandable to the people using them. Of course, honesty requires mentioning the limits. Weather can change everything. Strong wind may scatter smoke too quickly. Heavy mosquito pressure may require several approaches working together. Standing water left untreated nearby can overwhelm almost any comfort strategy. Some evenings are simply worse than others. That does not mean the method failed, it means reality showed up. The old timers I have known rarely expected one tool to solve every problem. They used layers, a little planning, a little observation, a little adjustment. The smoke pot fit into that broader mindset. It was never presented as magic. That alone made me trust it more. Eventually, I asked Earl why his setup looked almost laughably basic. He chuckled and tapped the side of the metal container with his boot. The answer, as I came to understand it, was that the container itself was doing very little. The secret was not the pot. It was the way the contents inside were allowed to smolder slowly instead of burn aggressively. That distinction changes everything. Too much flame creates heat and waste. Too much smoke creates discomfort. Somewhere in the middle sits a narrow sweet spot that many traditional users learned through trial and error. Finding that balance matters far more than owning a fancy container, and that brings us to the mistake nearly everybody makes on their first attempt. They assume more smoke must mean better results, so they build something that behaves like a campfire instead of a slow-working smoke pot. The result is a backyard nobody wants to sit in, mosquitoes included. Earl warned me about that long before I understood why. The funny thing is that avoiding this mistake turns out to be simpler than most people expect. Once you see how the pot is actually built and what controls that steady ribbon of smoke, the whole idea becomes surprisingly easy to understand. The first time I tried to replicate what I had seen, I made exactly that mistake. I built it too strong, too eager. I thought I was improving it. Instead, I turned it into something closer to a small, stubborn campfire. The smoke was thick enough to sting the eyes, and within minutes I understood what Earl had meant without him saying another word. Mosquitoes were not the only thing leaving the porch. I was leaving too. That moment taught me something simple that most old methods carry inside them. Strength without control is just waste. What actually matters in a smoke pot is restraint, a slow, steady smolder, not flame, not flare. Just enough heat to release a thin stream that drifts outward without choking the space where people are sitting. Many homesteaders describe it less like producing smoke and more like coaxing it out. That difference in language matters. It reflects a mindset that treats the process like tending a coal stove or keeping a wood stove alive through the night. You don't force it. You guide it, you watch it, you adjust small things instead of rebuilding the whole thing every time. Once I understood that, everything changed. The same simple container suddenly behaved differently. The yard didn't fill up. The porch didn't disappear. Instead, a quiet boundary seemed to form around the sitting area. Not invisible protection, not perfection. Just enough disruption in the air that the worst of the buzzing pressure backed off. And it wasn't instant in the way people expect modern products to be. It took a few minutes. Enough time for the air to settle. Enough time for the smoke to find its place. That's where the 12 minutes idea comes from in many stories. Less a promise, more a window where things shift from unbearable to manageable. Placement turned out to be just as important as the pot itself. Too close and it becomes irritating. Too far and it does nothing useful. Earl used to move it depending on wind direction, almost without thinking about it. He treated it like setting a chair in the right spot rather than deploying a device. I learned quickly that a porch with a breeze behaves differently than a still backyard corner, and each situation demands a small adjustment. There is no fixed blueprint that works the same every evening. That frustrates people at first, but it also gives back a kind of control modern systems rarely offer. Now, I need to be honest about something most people skip over. Smoke is still smoke. It affects comfort. It can drift where you don't want it if you're careless. It should never be used around enclosed spaces or where airflow is blocked, and even outdoors, it is not something to ignore. Pets, children, dry grass, and local fire rules always matter more than convenience. The old ways survived not because they were reckless, but because people paid attention. They watched wind, they watched weather. They didn't assume safety. They confirmed it every time they used a tool like this. When people hear $3 solution, they often assume the value is in the object itself. But that's not really what's happening here. The value is in understanding what actually controls the outcome. A container is just a container. The real difference comes from airflow, timing, and restraint. Once you see that, you stop looking for expensive answers to simple problems. You start noticing how many things around a home already have potential use if you understand them differently. A bucket becomes a tool, a can becomes a control point, a small change in placement becomes the real adjustment that matters. There was one evening I still remember clearly. The air had that heavy stillness that usually brings mosquitoes out in force. I set the pot out without much confidence, more as an experiment than anything else. At first, nothing seemed different. The usual buzzing started, the usual irritation followed. But then something subtle shifted. Not silence, not absence, just less pressure. Enough space opened up that conversation became possible again, without constant interruption. It didn't feel like victory, it felt like relief. And that distinction stayed with me longer than the method itself, and that's where most people miss the point entirely. They look for a permanent solution when what they actually need is a reliable moment of comfort, a way to reclaim the porch for an evening, a way to sit outside without constantly reacting. When you lower expectations from perfection to practicality, the whole idea becomes more honest and oddly more useful. Because once you stop demanding total control over mosquitoes, you start noticing how much control you actually can have over your own space. That realization leads into something larger than the smoke pot itself. Because once you've seen how a simple, almost forgotten method can change the feel of a backyard, it becomes hard to ignore how many other small practices like this have quietly disappeared. And what replaces them is rarely simpler. It's usually just more expensive. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected, and it's where the real meaning of this little pot begins to open up in a different direction.